Keith Whitley was found dead in his Goodlettsville home just after noon today. At this point, his death is a mystery to police. Barb Kramer reports.
Whitley has been gone for nearly 3 decades, but you still have all these posters and flyers up of him on your wall here.
And as long as I am in here, they will be up.
A beloved voice gone at 34. The headlines called it a mystery. The whispers called it inevitable. Keith Whitley, chart-topping, soul-bearing, the singer who made silence hurt, was found dead in his Goodlettsville home in May 1989. Fans still ask, what really happened in those final hours? Behind the hits were warning signs, failed interventions, and an industry that applauded the sound while overlooking the suffering. We'll reveal how early scars, relentless pressure, and a hidden battle with alcohol converged. Drawing from reports, testimonies, we'll trace his life. The morning of May 9th, the investigation, and the fallout that followed. Born in a minor key long before Keith Whitley became the voice that could silence a crowded bar with a single line, he was just Jackie Keith Whitley, a sensitive boy growing up in Sandy Hook, Kentucky. Nestled in the Appalachian hills, Sandy Hook was the kind of place where music wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life. The community was tight-knit, opportunities were scarce, and stories were passed not through books or classrooms, but through songs sung on front porches and at church on Sundays. In that world, music carried pain, hope, and survival, and young Keith absorbed all of it. He was born on July 1st, 1954, into a working-class family that knew both struggle and perseverance. His father, Elmer, was a hard man shaped by the coal and steel industries, a provider who rarely put emotions into words. His mother, Faye, was warm and deeply spiritual, the kind of presence that nurtured Keith's sensitivity rather than stifling it. She recognized early that her son wasn't like other boys. He wasn't loud, reckless, or brash. He listened more than he talked, felt things more deeply than he should have, and carried that emotion into everything he did. That depth would eventually define his music and his struggles. Keith certainly felt the pull of music. His older brother, Dwight, shared some of these inclinations, giving them common ground in guitars, harmonies, and old records. A lot of coaxing and a lot of lessons lured Keith in, first to sing a melody, then to interweave harmonic lines until the two voices felt like one. It may have been a simple Whitley home where there was relatively modest comfort to offer. The comforting music of bluegrass outlaw Carter Stanley Grade and Bill Monroe agitated the rooms. That was the ground zero for Keith's education. He never appeared for classes to learn anything about rhythm, phrasing, or the sheer power a voice could have. His classroom was the turntable accompanied by the voices of the greats for textbooks. When he crossed the threshold of his 9th year in his life, he was deemed to have rare gifts, a voice that bore a straining quality most akin to that of an adult male. The boy's friends and neighbors stood amazed at how he could so easily sing rings around adults, not in unrehearsed, highly polished ways, but just pure emoting. His voice came naturally with a certain frailty, not learned in any school, that of one who has experienced a good bit of hurt. But down in those moonlight hills of Kentucky, Keith was just a kid. However, somehow, life always has a strange way of deepening the fissures for a sensitive soul. At 13, tragedy struck Keith's world. In a car with Dwight and a friend, he was speeding on a winding mountain road. The car malfunctioned, it crashed, and all hell broke loose. Keith ended up changing the car out of it. His friend was slain in the accident, and Dwight was badly injured. Somehow, Keith walked away with just minor physical injuries. But the emotional damage was tremendous. The incident was his soul's signature burn. Thereafter, Keith had become somehow quieter, withdrawn into himself. Music for the child had changed from joyous sounds. It had become deeper, a mode through which the unsaid would be said. To sing in those days wasn't playing anymore. It had become therapy, confession, and survival rolled into one. His voice, already haunting, now had accents of new shades of grief and reflecting light. The audience did not hear a mere child singing. They heard one touched by sorrow, one who bore grief even when he smiled. Little did Keith know that ache would open doors and quietly unlock a dependency that followed him everywhere. Trial by Bluegrass. If Keith Whitley was born with a voice that carried sorrow, bluegrass gave him the stage to show it. His small-town upbringing had primed him for a life steeped in music, but chance and fate pushed him toward something bigger. At 14, Keith was already singing with his brother Dwight in local venues, church basements, and small-town contests. One of those contests, held in Easel, Kentucky, would become the turning point. That night in the audience was another young prodigy, Ricky Skaggs, just a year older than Keith, and already making waves in nearby Cordell. When Skaggs heard Keith sing, he knew instantly this wasn't just another boy with a guitar. Their voices blended with uncanny precision. Two teenagers producing harmonies that sounded as if they'd been rehearsed for decades. What started as casual collaborations soon became a full-fledged partnership, one that would carry both boys out of small-town obscurity and into the heart of bluegrass history. In a small way, their big break occurred after bluegrass legend Ralph Stanley saw them perform. Stanley, who together with his late brother Carter, rose to fame as a part of the Stanley Brothers, was back at it reconstituting the Clinch Mountain Boys. Hearing Keith and Ricky harmonize, he hired them both without hesitation. For the 15-year-old, this was indeed diving right into the deep end. Leaving high school behind, Keith toured the country, barely old enough to drive but already singing antique songs of heartbreak and redemption before audiences who accepted nothing less than perfection. Stanley did not coddle his musicians. He demanded, enforced, and held in utmost respect the tradition he carried. For Keith, it was truly a trial by fire. Days before, he was a small-town boy harmonizing to songs on the porch. The next day, he was traveling on buses, singing songs penetrated with death, sin, and loss, learning how to command stage presence with instant authenticity. It was occasionally overwhelming. The trips solidified Keith's maturity. All performances and rehearsals honed the gift into an increasingly sharper, deeper, more undeniable experience. This road had seen more than music. It had seen temptation. The culture of bluegrass was rough and tumble back then. There would be driving for long stretches, cheap motels, and great amounts of downtime between shows that were just made for drinking as a time filler. For Keith, this was not a social thing. From the outset, it was self-therapy, a way to relieve the tension of anxiety and sadness that buzzed inside him. Ralph Stanley would later mention being apprehensive about Keith's drinking habits, even back when he was a teenager. Already at 17, Keith was heavily into drinking before he began singing professionally. And yet, when Keith sang, it all melted away. Youth, pain, and drinking. The kind of magic that cannot be disguised emanated from his voice. Low but sweet, tortured but powerful, it was as if every note came from some primordial bottomless abyss so far back in time as to predate Keith himself. The audience did not just applaud him, they felt him. He was obviously not only surviving the crucible of Stanley, but thriving therein. The duo parted ways from 1975 onwards and got active in forming Whitley and Skaggs. They recorded cuts together, went on tour, and almost instantaneously earned the name of prodigies, breathing fresh life into bluegrass. But Keith was restless even then. His roots in bluegrass went deep, yet his spirit yearned for something wider. An avenue that could not only hold meaning for him in terms of the traditions, but also allow a canvas for the whole spectrum of human emotion. True, that way his bluegrass gave him roots, but Keith had known long the branches that were destined for him were far extending than those roots. Still, the years with Ralph Stanley were years of scars now. He had sent the hardest school possible to college, learned harmonies, perfected discipline, and earned his way to the legends. But what road life had given were lessons beyond music. Along came a new sidekick, alcohol, which was already starting to fuse with his persona. It dulled his pain, rounded off the edges, and gifted him a false sense of ease, as though it were following him into every rehearsal, every performance, every sleepless night. The bigger the stage, the louder the applause, and the easier it became to hide what hurt. Nashville finds the voice. By the early 1980s, Keith Whitley had proven himself in the toughest school bluegrass had to offer. He had shared stages with legends, traveled endlessly, and built a reputation as one of the most gifted young singers of his generation. But he wasn't satisfied. Bluegrass had shaped him, but he felt its walls closing in. He wanted a stage big enough to hold the full power of his voice, a sound that was equal parts mountain sorrow and unfiltered soul. That ambition led him south to the city that makes or breaks dreams, Nashville. In 1982, Keith packed up and moved to Music City, determined to carve out a solo career in mainstream country. It was a risky gamble. Bluegrass artists rarely made smooth transitions into the Nashville system, where polished production and radio-ready hooks often took precedence over raw truth. But Keith had one advantage few others could claim: his voice. It didn't just sing, it confessed, pleaded, and broke hearts with a whisper. He signed with RCA Records, a label known for developing heavy hitters, and began searching for the right sound. The release of Keith Whitley's first album, A Hard Act to Follow, came in 1984. Apt in title, for the album, although suggested potential, did not yet capture the essence of Keith Whitley. The album attempted to mix contemporary and traditional elements, a compromise of what RCA thought would sell and what Keith knew felt authentic. The result was respectable but uneven. You could sense the brilliance, but had not yet heard the full force of his truth. This wasn't enough for Keith. Chase trends, that's what he didn't want, coming up with paying homage to the music that raised him. And the next chapter was LA to Miami in 1985. The first to significantly touch the commercial success for Keith was this record, launching top 10 tracks like Miami, My Amy, 10 Feet Away, and Homecoming 63. An immediate interest fell into the industry. Fans connected to this voice not because it sounded polished, but because it was raw and filled with a sincerity you couldn't fake. But Keith was still torn between the glossy, radio-friendly sound preferred by RCA and the agonizing truth of the music that lived inside him. Throughout the development, Keith was contesting creative control. RCA preferred a sheen on the product, while Keith favored something more traditional, but not set in its ways. His ire festered until he found the perfect producer to help him bring his vision to life: Garth Fundis. Fundis had worked with George Strait and had a good ear for balancing tradition with commercial viability. Together, he and Keith began what was going to become the defining album of Keith's career. The name of this album was Don't Close Your Eyes, 1988. Not just a watershed album, but a revolution. The title song, written by Bob McDill, was Keith's first number one, a gentle ballad. It sounded not like the performance of a song, but more like the raw unburdening of a man. The album would go on to score him 2 more #1 hits with When You Say Nothing at All and I'm No Stranger to the Rain. These sang from the heart, written for moments so personal, and the voice spoke among multitudes into the softest of places in the listener's heart. What set Keith apart was that he didn't belt his songs, but bled them. His delivery was restrained but devastating, capturing heartbreak and vulnerability, which is more traditional in country music, while giving voice to the new generation. Critics called him new traditionalist, along with Randy Travis and George Strait. Fans considered him something more, the real thing. Finally, Keith Whitley found his voice in 1988. Not in terms of a singer, but in terms of controlling his sound as an artist. After an arduous struggle of compromises and pressures from the industry, coupled with personal battles, he had finally come up with an entirely personal album. And by doing so, he has set about becoming a legend in the making. A man who can, with nothing more than a melody and a whisper, restore the soul of country music. Success soothed the crowd, but not the quiet. The bottle stayed when the spotlight turned off. Love, bright lights, dark rooms. By the mid-1980s, Keith Whitley had everything most country singers spend their lives chasing. His records were charting, his songs were on the radio, and his name was whispered in the same breath as George Strait and Randy Travis. Yet the story of Keith Whitley isn't just about music. It's about love, passion, and the demons that never let go, no matter how bright the lights burned. In 1986, Keith met country singer Lorrie Morgan, daughter of Opry star George Morgan. Their connection was immediate, electric. Both had grown up surrounded by music. Both knew the pressure of carrying family and fan expectations, and both carried their share of scars. They fell in love hard and fast, marrying the same year. To fans, they looked like the perfect country couple, a rising star and a woman with a legacy name, building a family while chasing careers. Their son Jesse was born not long after, adding the joy of fatherhood to Keith's already full life. Keith was magnificent on stage, but off it, his life with Lorrie was filled with tenderness and devotion. Into this mixture, darkness crept. Keith had been fighting alcohol abuse since his teen years. Though he tried to control it, sobriety and its relapse were never absent in both of their lives. Lorrie's love for him was unconditional, but she was aware of how fast things could deteriorate. She has gone on to speak openly of situations where she poured out bottles, hid car keys, and even tied Keith to the bed to prevent him from scurrying away for a drink. Such moves were not merely dramatic. They were desperation's very moves. He was a man whom she wanted to save from himself. Every year that passed seemed to make the contradiction sharper in Keith's life. Professionally, he was unstoppable. His excellence in the recording of the Don't Close Your Eyes album firmly established his status as one of the most important voices currently in country. Industry insiders mentioned him being a future Opry member and possibly even a legend in the making. His songs were topping the charts at number 1, luring massive crowds to his tours, and his name meant something in a place where careers went into the highs and lows, almost overnight. But behind all that, he still fought with silence. The success has not put away the fears, the sensitivities, the shadows of grief that have dogged him from adolescence to date. Keith generally came with one face for friends, or multiple. First of all, there was Keith the artist, with bright eyes in the studio, enjoying being a husband and a father, and really kind, gentle, and humorous. Then there was Keith the drinker, withdrawn and unreachable, numbing emotions with a bottle. He could go long stretches sober, pouring his energy into music and family. But when the cycle broke, it broke hard. It got harder to pull him back each time. She was always there for him. She was at the shows with him, encouraging him through the tough parts, trying to make a home life that would be bigger than the bottle. "We loved each other too much," Lorrie once admitted, like the intensity was both glue and fire, burning too hot. From the outside, it looked like he'd made it. Inside, the clock was already ticking. 18 minutes, one morning. By the spring of 1989, Keith Whitley's life looked like a dream from the outside. His album, Don't Close Your Eyes, had produced 3 number ones, 1 singles. His follow-up, I Wonder Do You Think of Me, was finished and set for release. He had a wife who loved him, a baby boy at home, and the Grand Ole Opry whispering about his induction. He was 34 years old, with the promise of decades ahead. But on the morning of May 9th, that promise ended in silence. Lori Morgan was on tour in Alaska when she spoke to Keith for the last time. The call was tender, filled with everyday encouragement. "I love you, babe," Keith told her. "You're going to be great." There was no warning in his words, no sense of despair. If anything, he sounded steady. He told friends he was looking forward to golfing, writing songs, and catching up with buddies. For once, everything seemed normal. But addiction rarely announces itself with alarms. It whispers, waits, and strikes when no one's looking. There was Keith's brother-in-law, Lane Palmer, visiting the Goodlettsville house at around 8:30. They spent the morning drinking coffee and visiting. He mentioned having writing planned for the day, followed potentially by a round of golf. It didn't seem weird. Palmer was gone just before 10 o'clock. Everything appeared to be just another morning. Less than 2 hours later, Palmer returned. Where Keith had last been seen, fully in bed, now he lay unnaturally still. His skin was cold, his body limp. Life had fled. The paramedics came quickly, but there was nothing they could do. At 34 years old, Keith Whitley lay dead at home. Oddly enough, the official cause would come as a shock to even the most skilled investigators: acute alcohol poisoning. The blood alcohol content equaled 0.477, nearly 5 times the legal limit for driving, and well into the lethal range for anyone, even a man of Keith's tolerance. Experts would later explain that this equated to more than 20 standard drinks still coursing through his veins. There were no pills. There were no illegal substances. There was no evidence of foul play. Just alcohol. A quiet slayer that had shadowed him since his teenage years finally claimed him. For those who knew him, it was not only shocking that he died, but also that it happened in such a short time. The ship appeared to be making steady progress. A career at its peak, a marriage barely able to stay afloat, and plans for the future. But addiction doesn't obey those rules. It doesn't care about ability. It doesn't care about family, and it certainly doesn't give a damn about timing. Keith's body simply gave out on the morning of his death. The aftermath was instant and decimating. News spread like fire through Nashville, and the industry staggered. Just days earlier, Keith had been in discussions about tour dates with Garth Brooks. RCA was banking on him as the next torchbearer for true country. With fans already calling him the next big thing, it was all over in less than 20 minutes. Rumors swirled anyway, because accepting the real cause means confronting choices no one wants to own. Mystery versus reality. When news broke that Keith Whitley had died of alcohol poisoning, it should have been the end of the story. A gifted singer, gone too soon, claimed by a battle he had fought in private for years. Yet almost immediately, whispers filled the air. Friends, fans, and even strangers asked the same questions. Could it really have been just alcohol? Was there more behind his sudden death? And if it was that simple, how had nobody seen it coming? Part of the confusion came from the sheer scale of his blood alcohol level, 0.477. It was an almost unimaginable number, enough to slay anyone, and far beyond what most could consume in one sitting. To those who loved him, the official report felt too blunt, too final. People wanted another explanation, something that made more sense than a man at the height of his career quietly drinking himself to death in his own bed. Some wondered if pills were involved, though none were found. Others speculated about foul play, despite the absence of evidence. And still others whispered that maybe he had simply given up, a hidden despair too heavy to carry any longer. As a matter of fact, none of those rumors proved true. The toxicology report was clear: no illegal substances, No signs of trauma, no final message, only alcohol. And yet, that didn't stop the rumors. Country music has always loved its tragic heroes, and in the wake of Keith's death, stories began to spread like wildfire. There was no small amount of that. He had been destroyed by fame, duped by the very people closest to him, lost in some grand conspiracy. The truth, however, was even simpler and harder to face. Addiction. It is a relentless and most misinterpreted disease. So why did the mystery continue? Partly cultural. In the late 80s, alcohol addiction capital a taboo subject, particularly in country music. Woven into the fabric of the genre were bars, heartbreak, and bottles-written songs on the radio. To hear a star sing of whiskey on stage was acceptable, but not to envision it slaying him at home. Honesty-covered space became silent, and speculation flooded in. And the other thing was that he didn't appear as someone on a downward spiral. He wasn't washed up, disgraced, or forgotten. He was young, handsome, and the world was at his feet. He was pinning his hopes on having some of his greatest work yet recorded. He was almost inducted into the Grand Ole Opry. He had a wife and a little boy. In the public's eyes, a man with all of that won't sit there quietly in a corner, ignoring everything save his own bottle. But addiction doesn't care. It has no respect for timing or skill. Addiction does not come neatly packaged. It has been dubbed the silent slayer for some reason and will attack even when everything else looks perfectly fine. His family, not unromantically, was witness to the reality. They could relive all that with him. The times he was sober and the times he slipped back in. The number of times he tried rehab, the promises that kept piling up and gathering dust. Those nights they saw him fight and lose. Such an acceptance would mean that love, luck, or hard work or skill and sheer willpower were not enough to save him. It was a difficult realization for them to face. So instead, they went back to believing in mysteries, since a mystery only has to be solved. Addiction left nothing but pain. The hardest lesson wasn't about headlines. It was about the cost of looking away. Echoes that won't let go. The morning of May 9, 1989, silenced one of the most promising voices country music had ever known. But Keith Whitley's story didn't end with the official reports or the funeral. In many ways, his voice only grew louder after his passing, echoing through the songs he left behind, the artists he inspired, and the fans who refused to let him fade. Death stopped his heart, but it didn't stop his music. In the days immediately following his death, Nashville was shaken to its core. At his funeral, the grief was thick and visible. Ricky Skaggs, Keith's lifelong friend and musical brother, struggled to deliver a eulogy that could measure up to their bond. Lori Morgan, devastated beyond words, placed a single red rose in Keith's casket, whispering, "I will always love you." The sight of her collapsing in grief became one of the lasting images of his farewell. For an industry used to losing legends late in life, Keith's sudden departure at just 34 felt cruel, like a song cut off mid-verse. But his voice never went away for long. So RCA, in all its glory, did bring out a posthumous record to put forth the tragedy and treasure of what was left in its wake. Some titles, like I'm Over You, even sounded eerily prophetic, as if Keith himself had done his own goodbye. The airwaves across the country filled with his tunes, and in just one stroke turned him into a mourning figure and a legend. It was possible to turn on country radio for an entire year after his death and still listen to him, as if the world just wasn't quite ready to let go. Honoring Keith so quickly after his departure testified to just how deep the artistic bond went between him and all his collaborative peers. Keith's name lived on, not merely through sales of more posthumously released albums, but through the very embodiment of a sound country music had become because of Keith himself. His voice was an ache of vulnerability that defined truthfulness, the essence of whoever was listening. In an age where Nashville looked sickeningly toward glitzy superproductions with crossover appeal, Keith was there to remind everyone in the business of the real stuff: heartache, longing, and truth. Subtle like a blueprint, he became the unassuming figure for the new traditionalist movement, wherein all rubbed off from there on Randy Travis, George Strait, and a countless number of others carrying the torch from there. The echoes stretched further. Younger artists, Tim McGraw, Dierks Bentley, Chris Young, would later cite Keith Whitley as a defining influence, the man who showed them what real country music was supposed to sound like. Even decades later, his songs remained staples of live sets, tribute shows, and covers. Not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for a standard of sincerity that felt timeless. Recognition came slowly, but it came. In 1990, a year after his passing, Keith's single "I'm No Stranger to the Rain" won the CMA Award for Single of the Year. In 2022, more than 3 decades later, he was finally inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, a long overdue honor that cemented his place among the giants. Fans and family alike wept at the ceremony, knowing that while the award came too late for Keith to see, it didn't diminish the truth. His voice had earned its place in history. Keith Whitley didn't fade. He was taken by a battle too many fight in the dark. If this story moved you, share it. Tell us what song you return to when you need the truth. Like, comment, and subscribe, and keep watching the next video on your screen for more deep dives into the voices that changed country music and the hard lessons they left behind.